Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Simon. And actually, this talk morphs very well from the comments that you've just been making about how we're going to get dialysis at home and peritoneal dialysis more available, both in high-income countries for enabling people to have a good quality of life, but also in lower-income countries where it makes much more sense. You think of that video, that poor woman in India who had to move to a city away from her own home to have dialysis. It would make much more sense for her to have peritoneal dialysis at home in India. And yet India only has about a 4% rate of PD, mainly because of nephrologist reimbursement. I've just written an editorial with, or a review article with Wim van Biesen for Clinical Kidney Journal about visions for home dialysis in Europe. And what we said in that editorial was that we are never going to be able to grow home dialysis unless healthcare delivery becomes person-centred, not just our individual care of patients, but also the way we deliver healthcare. And so politicians, healthcare management, etc., really need to start thinking of the patient first. And that is why I've said it morphs nicely into what I'm going to be talking about. So this is my disclosure. Okay, nobody's put disclosures in their talks today, apart from the fact that we all know, treasure, and love Simon. My interest in art was mainly through Fred Finkelstein, who unfortunately was going to be here today, but is not well enough to travel. So he uses art in his talks, and I thought, and he has inspired me, led me around many art galleries in many countries, and also got me interested in global health, and I feel privileged of having been able to do what I am now doing in terms of global health delivery because of my contacts with Fred. And this picture was taken when I managed to get Fred invited to a BRS meeting in Leeds as the overseas speaker. And we subsequently, on the Saturday, Martin, Simon, and I, with respective partners, all had a fantastic hike in the Peak District. So, patient or person? This wonderful painting, it's not actually a painting, it's a video, it's a sort of highlighted, it's a backlit picture, which is in the Design Museum in Kensington, London, and shows manufacturing in China, in southern China, and how mechanized all this is. There are no individuals in that picture, and that is how we deliver healthcare. This is not, and modern China, I've just been to China, I only came back on Monday, and it's not surprising that that is how they are. This is how they live on the left-hand side. Huge, big apartment blocks, really ugly, rows and rows and rows of them. You are never going to be an individual in one of those apartment blocks. But it's not always been like that in China. The meeting was in Xi'an, and I managed to get to the terracotta warriors. You'd think that this was exactly the same. These were done over 2,000 years ago, and every single one of those warriors are individuals. They've got different faces, different clothes. A long time ago in China, they treasured the individual. So, on to art. This painting was in the exhibition in Tate, London, a good few years ago now, when they had an exhibition about German art after the First World War. And this shows the rather pompous bureaucrat who is responsible for looking after the disabled soldiers after they've returned to Germany. You can see he's completely disinterested in the poor soldier who's got no money and probably not eating and certainly no work. This painting, again, Tate London, is quite often on display and is currently on display because I saw it again only a few weeks ago. And it shows the doctor by the child's bedside. There's clearly a bond there between the doctor and the child. There was once a plenary lecture given at an ASN meeting many years ago now, where they showed this painting, took out the doctor and put a computer screen. That's often how we practice medicine. We think about figures. We're all guilty of that. Thinking about phosphate levels, KT over Vs, etc., rather than thinking of the person's well-being. So let's think about how somebody would feel, how any of you in this room would feel about having to start on dialysis or having any major medical treatment. This painting was used by Fred first, so I'll be quite honest about that. He gave it in a talk, I can't remember where now, and it's by Edward Hopper. It dates early 20th century, and the way I interpret it and use it in talks is to say that you're moving out of your comfort zone when you're starting on dialysis. And we need to recognise that with people. So you're moving out from the room on the left, you know, the comfortable furniture, etc., that we're all used to. You're going into a blank space and the unknown. It may all work out well, or it may not. We just don't know. We're all used to thinking about what happens after you come out of that room. The patient isn't. And then I saw, I don't use this one anymore now because I now use this painting by Edward Hopper, which I saw in the Whitney Museum when they had a Hopper exhibition there about 18 months ago. I always go to New York before the ASN, unless it's in San Diego. So I was staying with Sue and Fred, and we went to the Whitney Museum, and I saw this painting, and I thought this really does give you the feeling about what it is like to actually have to start on dialysis. You're going into that tunnel. That's what it must feel like to the individuals who are doing it. You're leaving behind the brightly coloured normal life. You're going into the unknown where everything is bleak. And we need to really think about how do we support people making those decisions. And equally, not get irritated with people who can't make those decisions and who run away from making any decisions. I've got many patients who seem to think that if they don't turn up to the clinic, they'll never have to start dialysis. And everybody who looks after people with advanced kidney disease will have exactly the same. And that's because they're frightened about going into that tunnel. So that moves on to shared decision-making, which I think we all forget is actually quite a recent concept. So the British Medical Journal ran a whole series of articles about shared decision-making, and this cartoon was published in 2012, which is only 12 years ago. And it's the patient is saying, do I tell him what I want? And the doctor, do I tell her what to choose? So shared decision-making is really important around treatment choices, and we need to establish what matters to the patient or to the person. And I think this lovely painting by Marc Chagall, which I saw in the Art Museum in Tel Aviv, really brings out thinking about a person as an individual, recognizing that they have their own beliefs, their own religion, their own cultural beliefs, their spirituality, their hobbies, you know, where they live, etc., and thinking about that person and trying to get to know them. I've been looking for a long time for a painting that I could use to describe shared decision-making. And my problem was solved when I was sent this postcard by one of my patients. So he was a man in his early 70s, he was a physicist, retired. We'd talked occasionally about exhibitions when I saw him. He had IgA disease, and his kidney function was going down, but at the same time, unfortunately, his cognitive function, as often happens, was declining as well. And the nurse I worked with he had made a decision that if he needed dialysis, he would go on peritoneal dialysis. But we were getting very concerned that actually with his declining cognitive function, he would find this very difficult, and that he may want to change his mind, and this may no longer be the optimal management for him. So we had a long meeting with his wife and 3 daughters, and he sent me this card. I'm not going to read it out, I'm sure you've all been reading it. But people used to, you know, the nurse, Debbie, who was working with me, teased me and said, it's all about the bare bottom. And he told me it had nothing to do with the bare bottom. The fact that he sent me this painting by Hockney was because he felt he was half in and half out of the pool at the end of the decision-making process. And I think that's probably how people often feel. They still don't know what they want, but they know they want to make a decision. He made a decision for conservative care after this. And in fact, he sent me, the next time he came to the clinic, he came with a document as to what points he wanted to stop treatment. And he was admitted, it was probably about a year later, with major infection, chest infection, and he died with no dialysis about 3 weeks later with palliative care. His wife then sent me this postcard. As you probably know, T died last Tuesday. I just want to thank you, etc. I found this card amongst T's papers. We took a granddaughter to Monet's garden many years ago, which proved a delight. And I thought this just showed, it was such a powerful statement about the quality of his dying, that they'd made the decisions, they were together when he died, and she could remember and wanted to share the pleasure of doing something with him and with the granddaughter. So moving on, many of you will have seen me showing this cartoon of Goya's. It was actually sent to me by one of my friends, my sons used to call him my concert companion, when I started getting interested in older people. So this cartoon was done when he was aged 83. It's in the National Gallery in Washington. I've never seen it in real life, and I'm still learning. We're still all learning as to how to look after older, frail people. When I started in dialysis, that postcard that Vivek showed, the photo of so it's people deciding who went on dialysis. I'm not quite that old, but when we started, you just did not have the number of older people that we do now on dialysis. And we need to learn how to look after people, and we need to realise that older people are different. They're all individuals, and we need to respect and understand about what getting older is like for an individual. And I think it's easiest to do this when looking at paintings rather than putting up bullet points about getting old, getting frail, what is frailty, etc. So this is by Van Gogh, sorrowing old man at eternity's gates. He's clearly depressed. He's poor. He's lonely. He's malnourished, etc. And and that At Eternity's Gates is the title that Van Gogh gave it. He knows he's at the end of life. We also need to respect and understand the bond between spouses. In the world of PD, we often rely on a spouse helping the other spouse doing dialysis. It's often also the other way around. Somebody may choose PD because their spouse has got dementia or has got their own health problems and they want to be able to look after them. So we're not just looking after an individual, we're looking after the individual and what's important for that individual, and that's often the spouse. This painting is in the National Gallery in London. And this fantastic painting I found in the Art Institute in Chicago when I stopped over in Chicago for 2 days after the ASN in Orlando and stayed with a friend. So this is Picasso, the old guitarist, obviously done during his blue period, so quite early on in his career. And just because somebody looks old and frail, they were something. This chap was obviously a guitarist. Being able to play the guitar is still important for him. And we need to think about that and understand that and learn about his goals when looking after him as his doctor. I also find art helps with the difficult topics when we're talking about prognosis, dying, end-of-life issues. Of course, death was a common theme of paintings, because death, everybody saw death. People died younger. So this painting dates from the 1600s. It was in an exhibition at the Queen's Gallery a few years ago. And this is called a vanitas painting. So and I've written there, so the art shows that this should be read as an allegorical painting. And the vanitas objects, i.e. the things that really say that life is short, okay, we're not here forever, is the lute with the broken string, the skull. Skulls are a common thing in art of this time period, representing the shortness of life, the transience of life. The candle with the flame extinguished, and the jewellery box with the lid open. And all of these signify the transience of sensory pleasures. This is a modern way of showing end of life and that we're all transient. So this was, I found, the first time I got to the Whitney Museum, the new Whitney Museum, after in its new building. And this is a giant candle. And the blurb that was on the wall describing this, so you can probably just see, you may see that in fact there's a little light in his head. I must have been quite early on in the exhibition, because the blurb said that by the end of his exhibition this would have completely melted and he wouldn't have been there. There's another painting that I got from one of Fred's talks. Cranach, German Renaissance painter, Fountain of Youth. And too often we think about dialysis as being a panacea. It's going to make everything better. So what this painting shows is that on the left-hand side of the old and decrepit go into the pool and coming out young and beautiful. And that, unfortunately, is the impression that we often give people when we're talking about medical procedures. We're not accurate. And we really need to understand what people's expectations are and try and make sure that they are actually in line with reality. I always remember vividly one person who had started on PD, hadn't come from my clinic, he'd come from another clinic, and he'd started on PD, and he had a huge scrotal leak, and was going to need a general anaesthetic to have this repaired. So I had asked him why he had started on dialysis. And he came in a wheelchair having had a stroke 10 years previously. And he said to me, he had started on dialysis because he wanted to walk again. He clearly had absolutely no conception at all. So we had a conversation, and he clearly was not going to be fit for a general anaesthetic because of his chest. Unfortunately, he came in that weekend and was then on, with a chest infection, and was on ITU on hemofiltration for 3 months until he died. This is another painting which I commonly use, and it was actually a subject of a whole article in The Lancet many years ago when they did a series of art and medicine. So this is the last self-portrait that Munch did. So Edvard Munch, I'm sure everybody knows, is a artist in Norway, and it's called Between the Clock and the Bed. So many people, we feel diffident and find it difficult to talk about end of life with our patients, but actually many of them know, and most of them are completely realistic, that they are at the end of life. So this is, as I said, a self-portrait. Behind him is all the bright things in his life, his paintings, his memories. The bed is that he is going to become ill and die. The clock with no hands, he doesn't know when this is going to happen. I'm coming to the end. So we should be trying to really have conversations with our people that we're looking after, and try and get end of life so that people are with their families. And this is painting by Rembrandt, which was in an exhibition in London, Jacob blessing the sons of Joseph. Just very quickly, some other uses of art and lectures. When I go around art galleries, it gives me something to focus on. I look at a painting and I often think, how could I use this? And I often take a photograph of it, and then I'll get a better vision of it from Google Images, and think about how am I going to use this. So this one is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and I think about this as somebody who's got all these ideas and worries and concerns, who's going to, that we're talking to, and we somehow know that we need to get all these together and find a clear pathway to be able to communicate with them. This one was in a very recent exhibition, or I think it may even be a current exhibition at the Royal Academy, and it's a useful way. I used it actually in a talk in Brazil 3-4 weeks ago, talking about global dialysis and the fact that military conflict can be a major barrier to delivering dialysis. By using a painting like this, you're not being specific about one side or another side or where that conflict is, but this is a conflict. This one is in another exhibition at the Royal Academy about Japanese art, and the reason I chose it is because this beautiful screen was done by 52 other artists and calligraphy. And calligraphers, so it's a team effort, and teamwork is really important to be able to deliver everything that we do. What I don't include, and was on the blurb in the Royal Academy, was that by the end of the process they were all drunk. And when I go to meetings, I always try and go to an art gallery. So this is in Bruges, so this was at EuroPD, fantastic Hieronymus Bosch triptych. And the blurb that went with it was that in the middle screen is the sinful world, the left-hand screen is heaven, everything is resolved and looking beautiful, and the right-hand screen is hell, So I've used this in talks about expanding home dialysis and saying this is where the middle is where we are at the moment, and we've got two options. Are we going to let home dialysis wither, move to the right, or are we going to move to the left? Heaven, and not everybody, but many more people have access to dialysis at home. Again, another exhibition at the Royal Academy of artists in the southern states of the US, the three-way bicycle. A really good way of talking about trying to get everything aligned so you can move forward. That too, you know, certainly in terms of access to peritoneal dialysis, there are too many barriers of everything sort of working against each other, and somehow or another we need to get all those wheels into line. And this is definitely my last slide. How many of you have been to Siena and seen the medieval hospital? And the beautiful frescoes that they have there. It's opposite the Duomo. It was still used as a hospital in the early 20th century, because there's photographs there of hospital beds against these frescoes. You know, our responsibility as healthcare providers is to the person that we're looking after. So the man in the front washing the person's, that's probably as much as they could do in those days. All the people behind are the busybodies, the managers, the politicians. We need to get them to also think about that person that we're looking after. And without that, we're never going to be able to deliver person-centred care. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to give this talk, Simon.